Okay, ready? Yeah, here we go. Now we can start. Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Well, welcome to the organizational meeting of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis of the 116th Congress. Thank you for your service on this committee. I expect the time we spend together will be constructive as we aim to develop policy recommendations to address the climate crisis. Today, we will adopt the committee rules, but before we do that, I would like to introduce our members and give my colleague, Ranking Member Graves, the opportunity to introduce the members from the minority. This committee is authorized by House Resolution 6, and we have an important charge to deliver recommendations to Congress and to the American people by March of 2020, just over 1 year from now, to address the climate crisis, and specifically to achieve substantial and permanent reductions in pollution and other activities that contribute to the climate crisis. Now, I have a homework assignment for everyone, and that is to read the 4th National Climate Assessment that was released by the Trump administration back in November. And I'd like to just read the opening paragraph from the 4th National Climate Assessment. Earth's climate is now changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization, primarily as a result of human activities. The impacts of global climate change are already being felt in the United States and are projected to intensify in the future. But the severity of future impacts will depend largely on actions taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the changes that will occur. Americans increasingly recognize the risks climate change poses to their everyday lives and livelihoods and are beginning to respond. So for this committee, I expect that we will find areas of common ground, and this committee has the opportunity to recommend action to standing committees in the coming months, not to wait until March of 2020. Ultimately, to fulfill our charge, we must address what is necessary for America to truly address the climate crisis. And with that, I'd like to introduce members of the majority on the committee. First, Ben Ray Lujan from Nevada serves as excuse me, I knew that, but my script did not know that. I apologize. Of course, the Assistant Speaker is from the great state of New Mexico. He comes to this committee with deep experience in Congress on renewable energy policy, as he served as chairman of New Mexico's Public Regulation Commission, where he helped strengthen the state's renewable energy standard. Also serves on the Great Energy and Commerce Committee. Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon serves on the House Science Committee, and her district is in Oregon, already grappling with rising seas, ocean acidification, and wildfires. Congresswoman Bonamici co-chairs the STEAM Caucus, the Oceans Caucus, and will be a valued member of this committee. Congresswoman Julia Brownley from California is a longtime environmental leader in California and serves on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Congresswoman Brownley's district suffered from horrendous wildfires in the past months, and I hope you will bring their perspective to us as we grapple with the climate crisis. Jared Huffman is also from California. He and I have shared a great interest in coastal issues and protecting our shores from oil spills. As chair of the Water, Ocean, and Wildlife Subcommittee in the House Natural Resources Committee, he brings a wealth of expertise to our committee. Welcome. Congressman Don McEachin from Virginia is one of Congress's most prolific leaders on environmental justice. He also co-chairs the CBC's Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force and serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee with me, as well as the Natural Resources Committee. Congressman Mike Levin from California serves on the House Natural Resources Committee and is a clean energy executive. He is new to Congress this term, but brings great enthusiasm for tackling the issues ahead. Welcome. Congressman Sean Casten from Illinois is a scientist and engineer by training and a clean energy executive from Illinois, so we'll benefit greatly from his expertise on this committee. Congressman Joe Neguse from Colorado led his state's Consumer Protection Agency, which includes the Public Utilities Commission, and he is the founder of New Era Colorado, a nonprofit devoted to advancing clean energy in the state. Welcome all. So with that, I'd love to give Ranking Member Graves the opportunity to provide some opening remarks and introduce the members, the other members from the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and very happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to join you in addressing what I think needs to be an important priority for this Congress. Coming from the state of Louisiana, where a few jobs back I had the opportunity to work on one of the largest resiliency projects in the nation, working to help to protect our communities from flooding and the threat of hurricanes in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, working to restore some of the 2,000 square miles of our coastal wetlands that have been lost and one of the most productive ecosystems on the North American continent. Madam Chair, there's no question that when you bring up this topic, when you bring up the topic of climate change, it results oftentimes in folks taking very divisive views. Folks often run to their corner. I want to reiterate something that you said. I agree with you. I do believe that there are many things, many objectives that we share. I think that we may find ourselves in the same place, perhaps for different reasons, but in the same place. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to reset, to redefine the narrative, to work together to address issues that are of mutual concern. Obviously, the protection of our communities, the protection of our environment is something that we all share. And we have a diverse group of members that are here that I think are going to have the opportunity on both sides to provide input for us to move forward and achieve some of the goals that I know are important to all of us. I think something that we need to focus on is not less science, but more. Actually bringing more science to the table, introducing new fields of science into this topic to make sure that decisions and recommendations we make are grounded, to make sure that they're realistic, to make sure that they're actually going to advance some of the objectives that I believe we all share. So once again, I want to say I'm looking forward to working with you and all the members of the committee. We have a fantastic group of members that we're going to be working with to partner with some of your folks, starting with Morgan Griffith from Virginia, serves on Energy and Commerce Committee, and strong science background, and has already been a great asset in some of our discussions. Gary Palmer from Alabama, that has been the beneficiary of let's see, the president of University of Alabama, we trained at LSU, the coach of the football team, we trained at LSU. But Gary played football for Alabama, but more importantly, spent decades running a policy institute in Alabama, and once again, just great background and helping to guide this Congress in thinking through the implications of policy. Buddy Cotter from Georgia represents the entire coast of Georgia, and the only pharmacist in the Congress. Buddy serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and once again, just a great asset for Georgia and for the Congress. Carol Miller from West Virginia, a bison farmer, a small business owner, and lives in the area where I used to river guide over in West Virginia, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. But once again, bringing the perspective of small businesses, bringing the perspective of West Virginia, which I think is really important to make sure that we understand the full impact of decisions and recommendations that we make here. And last, Mr. Kelly Armstrong, who represents a very small district in North Dakota, represents the state of North Dakota, and Kelly has background in agriculture and energy issues, family business, and looking forward to input from North Dakota, which has participated in an energy revolution for this country. And
I was glad to hear that the severe flooding in the Midwest has not affected your district, but our thoughts are with all of the folks across the Midwest who are going through that trauma right now.
So that's the team.
Terrific.
Yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Graves. Now we'll move to our first order of business, the consideration and adoption of the Select Committee's rules for the 116th Congress. I ask unanimous consent that the proposed rules be considered read and open for amendment at any point. You should have received copies of the proposed rules on the desk before you, and they were circulated on Tuesday night. 5 amendments were filed yesterday afternoon and evening and circulated electronically. We spent many hours over the last couple weeks to find agreement on the rules with the minority and incorporated many of their changes. The first amendment we will consider is the Graves Amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the rules for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, in my opening statement, I talked about how I think it's important that we sort of reset the narrative, redefine this issue, and we introduce more science into the discussion of climate change, ensuring that we're not looking myopically, that we're looking much broader, that we're taking into consideration what are the implications of the recommendations that we ultimately make. It's important that we look at what happens in Virginia, what happens in West Virginia, what happens in Louisiana and Florida, in our states that have experienced some of the impact of sea rise. And so what this amendment would do is it would ensure that as we move forward toward our recommendations that we're going to be issuing to the Congress, that we actually go through and quantify and understand things like the net effect on regional economies, including the impact on jobs and revenue changes, making sure that we understand the actual amount of greenhouse gases that these recommendations would impact or reduce, and understanding what that does in terms of how does that affect temperature, how does that affect sea rise. We need to use metrics, we need to use criteria to guide decisions. We can't just go out there and say that I think it'd be fantastic if we had everyone convert to wind-powered airplanes. Let's understand the implications, both good and bad, to where we can understand the trade-offs and make informed decisions. I'll say it again. We want more science incorporated into this process. Quantifying the acres of wildlife habitat that are preserved or enhanced as a result of the recommendations that we make to the Congress. I talked about the ensuring that we understand the temperature changes, and something, once again, that's really important, especially, Madam Chair, thinking about just in recent years, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, Florence, the wildfires in California, the awful flooding, as you noted, that's occurring in many of our Midwest and northern reaches of the United States as a result of snowmelt, rainfall, and other watershed challenges, literally from the top of this country down to my state in Louisiana, where our rivers are at flood stage. Making sure that we understand what type of pre-disaster or what type of mitigation and adaptation investments will return cost savings, and how we can make the best principled investments to make our communities, our families, our homes, and our businesses as safe as possible. So I urge adoption of the amendment. I think it's important that we have quantifiable information and understand if decisions that are being made or recommendations being made by this committee could cause adverse impacts. Let's make sure that they're balancing benefits as a result of those recommendations. Yield.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. I want to thank the ranking member for his thoughtful recommendations. But as we do our work, every member will have an opportunity and will have ideas about how we should evaluate the information that's presented to us. And we will receive a lot of expert testimony and recommendations. So as we develop committee reports, members will have an opportunity to provide input, what any given report will cover. So it's premature at this point to include in our rules any specific analyses. Under Rule 5C, every member can have the opportunity to file additional views to committee reports. If the ranking member feels the analyses outlined in his amendment are not covered in the committee report, he will have the opportunity to provide any supplementary analysis as additional views. So I urge a no vote and yield back. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to this amendment on the Republican side? Then on the Democratic side.
Thank you, Madam.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to say with respect to this amendment and also I believe all of the other Republican amendments that are suggesting all of these quantifications and studies that they would like to see for anything that comes out of this committee. I'd like to see some of that stuff too, but I think it's important as we try to understand the costs and trade-offs of some of these climate solutions that I hope we'll be recommending, that we also really take a careful look at the cost of the status quo. Because otherwise, what's the point of pretending that action is always expensive and inaction is always free? So I don't think this committee has the budget or the scope or the time frame to do the kind of exhaustive economic analysis, especially to the level of certainty that seems to be requested in many of these amendments. But what I would offer to Mr. Graves and to my other colleagues across the aisles, I'll be happy to work with you on a separate bill that would bring forward the kind of study that looks at both sides of the ledger, the cost of inaction, and also the relative cost of some of the climate solutions that we are likely to recommend, so that we can point to the most cost-effective measures. That's a good way to go. It's getting harder to do that, though, because the government scientists that we would normally look to for this information are being reassigned and pushed out of their jobs, and their budgets are being slashed. In some cases, entire agency mission statements are being scrubbed of references to climate change. Entire websites are being taken down and scoured of any references to climate science or climate data. The Trump budget continues this march against the kind of science and analysis that we would look to them to provide. So in light of all that, we really do need, I think, a bipartisan bill in this Congress to begin to bring forward the cost of inaction on climate change, as well as a menu of economic choices that some of these amendments point to, so we can make good decisions. And I'll be happy to work separately with you on that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for your comments about working with us, and I'd love to see if we can figure out a way to do that. Because, look, we can sit here and write a report that has utopian views. They've got to be grounded. One of the challenges with this issue, as I stated in the opening statement, is that when you look historically, what's happened is that folks just go to their corners. Folks go to their corners, and so what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens, largely. And so I'd love to work with you on that, but I think that it's really important that decisions, recommendations we make have some type of sideboard, some type of criteria or parameters to where we know what the net effects were going to be. And also, I use the word net intentionally because that word is in here. And net, as you know, it actually considers different impacts and it looks at a baseline condition and then determines what happens. And so if you want to add the word net in here, you want to add the word baseline in here, I'd welcome your changes to this amendment that would do that. Now, one comment that you made, you said that this committee doesn't have the budget, the scope, or the time frame. You and I, we serve on 3 committees together, which is incredible. But and I always enjoy having discussions with you because I think that you're thoughtful and you represent your constituents. Our constituents are very different, as we've discussed many times. But to go home to folks in West Virginia, to go home to folks in Virginia or Kentucky or Ohio, and say that I'm sorry, we didn't have the time or the budget to figure out if you were going to lose your job or not, or lose your house or not. I'm concerned that that's insensitive, and we could actually make irresponsible decisions.
If I might just reclaim whatever time I have left on that. I don't think you're going to have that conversation, Mr. Graves. This committee is going to produce at the end of our work a report. There's no scenario under which that report causes any of your constituents to lose their jobs and force you to have that hard conversation. I would love for us in this Congress to move a lot faster and to, maybe by the spring actually produce legislation where we could accelerate some of those conversations. But it's just not realistic to think that the product of this committee's work is going to force you to have those hard conversations. I think you and I should work separately on bringing forward a study that will look at the economic baseline, that will look at the tremendous cost of the status quo, because when you focus only on the cost of action, you are dignifying this notion that the status quo is free. we're going to pay for climate change, whether we take action or not. And in fact, I actually really like one of the points that you've put in your rule changes. You talk about
You better watch it. You're going to lose your election.
bringing forward an analysis of the potential cost savings of pre-disaster mitigation. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to understand, because I think it will show that many things we need to do to address climate change will save money and will have economic benefits, net benefits. And I'll be happy to work with you separately on these things.
Thank you. You better watch
Yield back.
You better watch that fiscal conservative talk.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else to be heard on the Graves Amendment? Seeing none, hearing no further debate, the question is on adoption of the Graves Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No.
Recorded vote, please, Madam.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The ranking member has requested a roll call vote. The clerk may call the vote.
Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Ms. Brownlee? No. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Huffman? No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McEachin? Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Griffith?
Aye.
Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Carter?
Aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mrs. Miller? Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
6 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment, the second amendment we'll hear, is the Carter Amendment. We'll now consider the Carter Amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the rules for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis offered by Mr. Carter of Georgia.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and let me begin by saying that climate change is real. Protecting our environment is real. We understand that. It's something that it's incumbent upon us as members of Congress, and particularly and specifically incumbent upon us as members of this committee to address, and to address in a bipartisan fashion. My hope, and I hope that this is shared by all of us, is that the product that is generated out of this committee will be a bipartisan product. It will be a product that will benefit all Americans and benefit all of us, because it's extremely important. We acknowledge that. We certainly feel like it will be something that we'll take pride in, and that all of us will have a partnership in. It's important, and what my amendment does is essentially say that for every two field hearings that the majority has, that the minority would have one. Now, in order to come about to a bipartisan consensus, it's important that we all share in our experiences, in our interest. And certainly the field hearings will be a big part of that. A big part of what we study here will be where we go and the hearings that we participate in. To Ranking Member Graves' point about going to our separate corners, it would do us no good if we only looked at an agenda that favored one side. So my hope and my intention with this amendment is just to make sure that everyone has participation in this. I tell my staff often, and one of my favorite sayings is that none of us is as smart as all of us. This just assures us that we're going to have the opportunity to share in the decision-making about the field hearing. So I would submit this memo, or submit this amendment, Madam Chair, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment for 5 minutes. One of the charges of this committee will be to hold field hearings. We will likely hold more field hearings than the typical committee in Congress. And I need your suggestions. Ranking Member Graves and I have already roughly talked about some areas of the country that we should visit to hear their stories and see what other communities are doing on the transition to clean energy. So I would like your suggestions, all of the members of the committee. I hope we will find a number of places of mutual interest. And I'll be consulting with the ranking member about possible locations and topics, but all of you. But it's unnecessary to incorporate an arbitrary constraint on field hearings as proposed in this amendment. I would also note that Rule 10 governs travel by the committee. It allows the chair to authorize travel related to our jurisdiction and therefore could provide additional opportunities to engage with stakeholders outside of Washington, D.C. So this amendment is unnecessary at this time, and I urge a no vote. Is there anyone else that would like to be heard on the Carter Amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the Carter Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it.
Vote.
Recorded vote. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Bonamici. No. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Ms. Brownlee. No. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Huffman. No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Meekichan. Mr. Levin. No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Caston. Mr. Neguse. No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves.
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mrs. Miller. Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Madam Chair.
No.
Madam Chair votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
6 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The question now occurs on the third amendment, the Palmer Amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to offer his amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered read.
Without objection.
An amendment to the rules for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, offered by Mr. Palmer of Alabama.
Am I recognized, Madam Chair?
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment is simple and straightforward. It would require that the committee include in its reports the cost of its recommendations on local economies. This is a common sense idea. The American people, our constituents, deserve to know the cost of the policies that get reported out of the committee. I would I'd like to yield to the ranking member for a moment to amend the amendment.
I'm going to talk very slowly because can I? Just want to make sure I put it in the right spot. I want to ask my friend from California, all my friends from California, but especially my Huffman friend from California. What about on this one, Mr. Huffman? If we included in here, if we amended this to put in a baseline and basically say, to have a comparative in here, to amend the amendment, do a second degree, and go ahead and look at the cost of no action, add or the failure to take action, and would that lure you over to the bright side?
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
So approaching it this way, the net effect, which would involve a baseline analysis of the cost of inaction, is a great place for you and I to start on a separate bill that brings forward the kind of economic study that we're talking about here. But it's going to be a big study, let's be really clear. And it will include, I don't even know whether this committee's report will include all of the specific menu of solutions that we would need to look at. It may need to be broader even than what this committee is able to undertake in the next 11 months. So let's get to work on that, Mr. Graves. I mean, let's not burden this committee with speculative and economic hoops to jump through. Let's you and I undertake this separately and do it right.
Well, if the gentleman will yield back.
Yeah.
Thanks. So here's the challenge. Could we go out and go carry out a big report? Yes. But how are we going to know what the recommendations are? How could we possibly evaluate the recommendations? We'd have to guess what the committee's going to do. My concern, and the chair may mention this before, my concern is what's going to happen is we're going to sit here and we're going to make these recommendations and, as you know, hand them out to the various committees, to Energy and Commerce and Transportation, Natural Resources and Science and others. give them recommendations, and then it was said before that those committees can then go through and do an analysis. Well, why are we here? What
Would the
is our
gentleman
purpose?
yield?
Absolutely.
But by the same token,
Because I see the clock's frozen. We can talk as long as we want.
this is great.
Yeah.
I love it. It's right twice a day. By the same token, by the time you know what this committee's final recommendations are in the report, you're not going to have time to do the exhaustive net economic impact that you were talking about here. And what you're really doing is creating a recipe for this report never being completed. So again, I want to invite you to work with me to do it right. Let's broaden this subject. Let's call in the National Academy of Sciences. Let's have peer-reviewed science. Let's look at the severe cost of inaction, and let's compare it to the costs and benefits of some of the solutions that are likely to be required to this climate challenge, and let's put a bill together.
And so I want to reclaiming time. I just want to actually reiterate or restate your words. You just said that we're not going to know what we're doing, and that's my very concern. That is my concern, is that we're not going to know what the implications of our recommendations are. And so we're asking for more science to be injected into the process to where we can make informed decisions, understanding the trade-offs of decisions. And I believe the gentleman from Alabama's amendment is appropriate. I want to ask unanimous consent if we can add "or the failure to take action" at the end of the amendment before the period.
Without objection.
And yield back.
Reclaiming my time, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for entertaining this discussion. I think it's very helpful, and I appreciate that very much. As someone, he mentioned my background, by the way, to correct the record, I practiced football at Alabama. But also, prior to running the think tank, I worked for 2 international engineering companies, including Combustion Engineering and the Environmental Systems Division. And I understand a couple of fundamental principles. One, to get to the right solution, you must first properly define the problem. And second, to get to a feasible solution, you've got to understand the cost. So this amendment is offered in good faith. It's not to take away from the work, to impede the work. And I really would appreciate the consideration of the committee to adopt this amendment. I do think we have time to do it. And again, having worked in the engineering field, I understand costs and estimating. I actually worked on the cost side. So with that, Madam Chairman, I would encourage the members of the committee to vote yea on this, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Palmer, for this thoughtful amendment. But as noted during the debate on Mr. Graves' amendment under Rule 5C, every member can have the opportunity to file additional views to the committee reports and the final report in March of 2020. I anticipate there will be plenty of opportunities for us to incorporate the analysis of experts. We're going to rely on them. That will be in our purview. If you feel the analysis outlined in your amendment is not covered in the committee report, you'll have an opportunity to provide any supplemental analysis and additional views. And I think as the standing committees take up our recommendations, whether it's as we report routinely in the coming months or after the final report, there will be a lot of analysis, financial analysis, and discussion and debate over what course this country finally takes to confront the climate crisis. So at this time, I urge a no vote. Is there anyone else who would like to be heard on this?
Chair yield?
I will yield. I will yield to Mr. Lujan.
Madam Chair, and I very much appreciate the conversation and the goals that are being outlined with making sure that we're able to get information into this committee. I think that's why we've assembled and we've all agreed to this important responsibility. I just hope that when we leave here today that it's not being suggested that this information is not going to be allowed to be brought into this committee, that this committee rejected bringing evidence in as we go out and we embark on our beautiful districts over the next few days, and we're speaking about the important work of coming together in here, and that truly, that we take full advantage of the witnesses that are coming in, the full opportunities that have been laid out in the rules as presented by Chairwoman Castor and 5C, that we can submit additional information and evidence and data sets into the record as allowed. So I appreciate the conversation. I very much look forward to working with my colleagues, and I yield back to the chair.
I yield to Congresswoman Bonamici.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also appreciate the conversation, and it's a good one that we're having. But I'm very concerned about amending the rules of how the committee operates with things that we have to consider, and could that be read as what we can't consider if it's not in the rules? So again, all of these things are important conversations to have. I am certain that as we move forward, we will be talking about all of these issues and how they affect our local economies and how the specific policies that we're talking about are going to affect the people we represent. But they don't belong in the rules about how the committee operates. We will have a better product if all of these things are considered. But these are the rules about how the committee operates. I don't want to limit us to telling us what we have to consider or not consider in the operational rules of the committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank the gentlewoman. She yields back. I yield back. Anyone else like to be heard in favor of the Palmer Amendment? Mr. Griffith, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I mean, this is straightforward. It does not, the amendment does not limit other discussions, but it sets out one of the concerns that I think a number of us have on the minority side, and that is that there are a lot of folks who will, bring in proposals that sound great on paper, but if you don't take in the human costs, my district has suffered tremendously with a huge number of loss of jobs. It may be something that we want to make sure we're looking at when we're looking at the science, but make sure we're having a positive impact, or at least know what the negative impact is on the economies. Are we just forcing jobs to other countries, or are we actually doing something that's going to help the environment and the climate worldwide? Because if we don't look at this and we just say, well, we're just going to look after what the United States is doing, and we shift the jobs from places like my district and other districts like mine where we have natural resources and we have jobs that are heavily tied and the economy is heavily tied to the natural resources of the region, and we don't look at how it's going to have an impact on the economy, I think it's a failure. And this amendment does not limit the committee. It's an amendment that helps, be transparent. We're just going to say, here it is. Just like we need to take a look at the science. And if there's something that we can do, even if it has a cost associated with it, that will actually make a difference in the long run on the climate and make a positive difference, then we ought to have that information too. But I just think it's a fairly straightforward amendment that just assures that we're not going to go headlong into some policy that doesn't benefit us on the climate effectively and negatively impacts large regions of the country. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Would anyone else like to be heard on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on adoption of the Palmer Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Ms. Brownlee? No. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Huffman? No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McEachin? No. Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Griffith?
Yes.
Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Carter?
Aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mrs. Miller? Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
6 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next question is on the Armstrong Amendment. I will now consider the Armstrong Amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the rules for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis offered by Mr.
Without
Armstrong.
objection, the further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in our pitch for field hearings, I'll start. It's not easy to get to North Dakota, but when you get there, it's a fantastic place. Prior to getting elected into Congress, I represented a rural district in the state legislature. And in my district, we grow all the cereal grains. We have a huge livestock industry. We have an ethanol plant. We had the first small refinery permitted in the United States since 1976 that is now being converted to a biodiesel plant. We are on the southern half of the Bakken Shale oil play, so we have oil and natural gas. We move all of our commodities by pipe, truck, and rail. And we also, in the southern part of my district, have the largest wind farm in the state of North Dakota. So if you ever want to see an example of doing an all-of-the-above energy strategy, I would love to have you all to dinner at my house. But one thing they all have in common is even wind farms, they have an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And when we are doing these things, we also have to remember every one of those economies that are in my district don't exist just locally. They exist in a global economy. And we play in a global economy in every one of these fields. And I mean, we can go back to 1992 and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change stated their objection was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with climate. Paris Climate Accord is the same thing. In an effort to reach its stated goal of limiting global temperature increase by 2 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. My wife is from Oslo, Norway, so I always remember there's 2 types of countries in the world. There's the ones that use the metric system, and there's the ones that landed on the moon. So, provides that the parties aim to achieve balance in greenhouse gas emissions and removals by the second half of the century. So, greenhouse gas emissions are clearly identified as an important variable in the climate conversation, and common sense just suggests that this committee should conduct itself by quantifying the amount of greenhouse gas emissions reduced as a result of our recommendations. And I just, because the arguments on these are going to be the same both ways, and I just want to say, and I do too appreciate this conversation a lot, but I think the problem when we go to the situation of every member can file their own report, I think that forces us back into our own bunkers. Because if this committee doesn't have the resources, I don't know how all your offices run, but we're really busy, and I think there's a big difference between filing reports on the record that we get from think tanks, whether they're a liberal think tank, a conservative think tank, gathering this information from outside resources, and this committee taking ownership of what we are putting there. And we have to consider the fact of what is the economic cost, what is the worldwide global impact versus how it affects producing states like mine. I mean, we're a commodity-based economy. We have 750,000 people in the whole state. We produce food and energy for the region, the country, and the world. And those are important factors to consider when we're doing this. So that's my amendment. Let's follow the advice of every math teacher I've ever had and show our work. Then with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. I want to thank Mr. Armstrong for his thoughtful comments. I anticipate that the committee will be synthesizing many of the expert opinions and analysis that are submitted to us, but it's premature to put anything in writing that hamstrings us in our ability to do so. As I noted during the debate of Mr. Graves' first amendment under Rule 5C, every member can have the opportunity to file additional views to committee reports as well. If Mr. Armstrong feels that those analyses outlined in his amendment are not covered in the committee report, he'll have the opportunity to urge us on to do better, to provide supplementary analysis as additional views. So at this time, I'll urge a no vote on the amendment and yield back. Would any other member like to be recognized on the Armstrong amendment?
Madam Chair.
The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just had a quick question. I got hung up when he talked about representing rural North Dakota. Could you distinguish rural versus urban North Dakota? No, I'm kidding. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the Armstrong amendment? Seeing none, the question occurs on the adoption of the Armstrong amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Ms. Brownlee? No. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Huffman? No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McEachin? No. Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Palmer? Yes. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Carter? Aye. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mrs. Miller? Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Madam Chair?
Votes no.
Madam Chair votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
6 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. We'll now consider the Miller Amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the rules for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis offered by Carol Miller of West Virginia.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and my colleague from West Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
I rise today to speak in favor of my amendment. My amendment is very straightforward and simply provides accountability by establishing data instead of fear or conjecture. It requires that any recommendations made by this committee include a quantification of how the recommendation will affect sea level rise. In addition, my amendment also requires the committee to quantify the change in global temperatures as a result of the recommendation. If this committee is serious about addressing the issue of climate change and the environment, this amendment should be easily accepted. I believe it is important that we and the American people know how actions taken by this committee will actually make a difference in our global climate. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. As with the other amendments, and noted during the debate on Mr. Graves' amendment and the subsequent amendments under Rule 5C, every member will have an opportunity to file additional views to committee reports and to offer their analysis, and we'll all be working together to move these forward. If Ms. Miller feels the analysis outlined in her amendment is not covered in the committee report and committee discussions, she will have the opportunity to provide supplementary analysis as additional views. So I urge a no vote on this amendment, and would like to see if any other member would like to speak on the amendment. I could yield that time, so I'll yield back and recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, very quickly, I just want to make note, even referencing your opening comments, the charge of this committee is to carry out measures that help to prevent the adverse implications of polluting the environment, of climate change. If we don't take science, if we don't make science-based informed decisions, I'm concerned that we're just going to go out there and just throw everything at the wall without having some type of measure. And I understand we can file supplementary views. This needs to be foundational. Nothing should be in the report without some type of analysis or quantification. This is, I mean, what happens if we go out there and we go destroy economies? What happens if we do things that actually have an adverse impact on the very objectives that we're working to achieve? I want to thank the gentlelady from West Virginia for offering this amendment. This is about quantifying the effects of sea rise, of our recommendations, quantifying the effects on temperature changes on our recommendations. These seem foundational to the very charge of this committee. And I can see that many of you are feeling that bipartisan tug to my left, and I just want to give you an opportunity to throw in a yes vote on an amendment that it really, again, it's foundational to this committee's charge. I urge adoption and yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
I can see it.
Any other members would like to be heard on the amendment? If not, hearing no further debate, the question is on adoption of the Miller Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Ms. Brownlee? No. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Huffman? Mr. McEachin? No. Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Palmer? Yes. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Carter? Aye. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mrs. Miller? Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
6 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. At this time, are there any other amendments to be proposed? If no, we'll move to adoption of the rules. The question is now on adoption of the rules. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The rules are adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I now ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the rules subject to approval of the minority. Hearing no objections, it is so ordered. I want to just briefly make an announcement here at the close that our website is up and running, climatecrisis.house.gov. The Twitter account is also available. I urge you all to follow at Climate Crisis on Twitter. And if there is no further business, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's meeting. I didn't do final passage on the, okay, excuse me. Let's go back to, the question is now on adoption of the rules. All those, I thought we did do that. Yep, it was a voice vote. That they have been working, our staff members have been working so hard to get to this point. I want to thank the minority staff and the majority staff for all of their hard work to helping to launch this committee. It's not easy to bring a committee into existence that doesn't exist, so thank you to everyone's staff. We look forward to working together. So if there's no further business, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's hearing, today's meeting, and I look forward to a productive year ahead. Without objection, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Best meeting we've ever had.